The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades, but each week we'll break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. This week we are looking at the Congo Rwanda conflict. Since 1996, post the Rwandan genocide, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been in conflict with rebel groups, resulting in over 6 million deaths. This makes it the deadliest global war since World War II. The conflict in the Central African country has been described as one of the most complex and longest humanitarian crises in the world and has involved multiple neighbouring countries. And while the rich natural resources should have made Congo a wealthy country, it has instead led to violence, exploitation, poverty, and nearly 7 million people without a home. So where and when exactly did Congo's war begin? And how is its much smaller neighbour, Rwanda, still its biggest enemy? Joining me now to break it all down for us is Jason Stearns, founder and chairman of the Congo Research Group. Jason, thanks so much for your time. To kick off, can you simplify where this all began? Let's go back to the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Why is the DRC still involved in a war almost 30 years later?
Yeah, thank you. So in 1996, as you mentioned, this kicked off due to a variety of factors, but the trigger really was the Rwandan genocide. The Congo at the time in 1996 was really a decrepit state that had suffered under 32 years of misrule by Mobutu Sese Seko, a dictator. And by that point in 1996, the country was hosting a variety of different rebel groups. And the most important of those rebel groups were the people who had just perpetrated the Rwandan genocide and who had fled into the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, along with around 1 million refugees. And so in 1996, the new Rwandan government, the one that's currently still in power, invaded the Eastern Congo in order to break up those refugee camps and to get at its arch enemy that were based in those refugee camps. That's how the whole thing started. That then the conflict, however, has gone through a variety of different permutations since then. But really, that enmity between Rwanda and the Congo has persisted, with Rwanda up until today still claiming that it suffers from security threats coming from the Eastern Congo, and the Congolese government saying that the Rwandan government is encroaching, invading, and even has territorial ambitions in the Eastern DRC.
So, Jason, to simplify for someone who's not aware of, the complexities when it came to this war, is it safe to say it's still going on still because of an act of retaliation for those who felt that they were targeted in the Rwandan genocide, and that the Congolese government and that majority group, the Hutus, are responsible? It's still retaliating 30 years later?
Well, that's what the Rwandan government says. But actually, if you look at the most recent round of fighting between the two countries, began in November of 2021. And if you go back and trace what was happening in November of 2021, there really is relatively little evidence that Rwanda was facing a security threat, an imminent security threat, at least at the time. And so whereas the Rwandan government does say that, in public it rejects it, but in private it admits that its troops are there. It has roughly 3,000 to 4,000 troops, special forces in the Eastern DRC. And in private, it does admit that they're there, but that they are, as you just mentioned, facing an existential security threat. That really doesn't bear up to scrutiny, however, and it seems much more likely that Rwanda actually invaded due to regional competition with other neighboring countries. Rwanda is not the only country involved in the Eastern DRC. Burundi to the south, Uganda to the north are also involved. And so there was regional competition going on. And I think more broadly, Rwanda wants to make sure that the DRC remains within its sphere of influence, that it still keeps a foothold there. And so I think those are more reasonable explanations for what happens than an imminent security threat, which really it's difficult to say that existed at that time.
Jason, we'll get into the competition with resources and that, desire to take over the Congo area. But since 1996, there's been, 6 million deaths in Congo. Why has the Congolese government performed so badly in protecting its people?
Well, the Congolese government has changed during that period, obviously, but since 2019, it's been under the presidency of Felix Tshisekedi, who just recently won another term in office. It faces enormous difficulties. The Congo is a country the size of all of Western Europe put together. He was in particular dealt a very bad hand. It faces endemic corruption, infrastructure problems. There are no roads connecting the whole country. And so there's an enormous challenge. It has a very, very small budget compared with the enormity of the country. But I think it's important also to understand that it's part of the problem in the sense that it has invested in conflict to a certain extent. The Congolese government's more concerned about managing its security forces really than providing security for the broader population. It's more concerned that those security forces could rise up against it. And so what it does is it doles out patronage, it doles out opportunities for enrichment for its senior commanding class, and does very little to hold it accountable. And so you have a situation in which senior members of the Congolese army themselves are complicit in the violence. They themselves are involved in racketeering, in funding and arming some of these armed groups in the Eastern DRC. And so it's a system in which many of the main actors, the Congolese government, the Rwandan government, and other political elites in the region are actually invested in this conflict and making this conflict persist until today.
So it's all the conflict is stemming from the top. It's not just from Rwanda. It's stemming from the Congolese government. There's no one taking care of the 99 million people that are currently in poverty. But Jason, I want to get into what's been happening in the last few years or even the last few months. Why has the situation escalated so much that there's more violence? What does it look like currently on the ground for the Congolese people?
Well, I think it's important to highlight that the Rwanda-Congo conflict is probably the most important one of these conflicts at the moment, but it is not the only one. There are a variety of overlapping, interlocking conflicts in the Eastern DRC. There are roughly 100 different armed groups in the Eastern DRC. And so the M23, which is the group that Rwanda is backing, is only one of many. The Rwanda-Congo conflict has displaced around 1.5 to 2 million people, but there are 7 million people displaced altogether. It gives you an idea that it's very important, but it's far from the only conflict. That conflict, however, has escalated. As I mentioned, in November of 2021, it began, and it has escalated because the Rwandan government has dug down, has not really seen in its interest to bring those rebels to the negotiating table. And so the M23 troops, backed by the Rwandan government, have advanced on the major trade hub of Goma, pushing hundreds of thousands of refugees into camps or internally displaced people into camps around Goma. And that really has created a humanitarian catastrophe around Goma, with many civilians now facing not only hunger and starvation, but also facing serious security threats in those camps that just recently were, for example, were subject to shelling. They get caught in the fighting between these two different sides. And so that I think is at least one of the reasons the conflict has gotten quite a bit worse in recent months.
Goma does seem to be, the capital of all the current conflict, but the recent evidence of violence was on Friday. Can you walk me through the strikes that occurred there?
Yeah, so this is a good example of this being caught between the two sides. There was shelling that took place into some of these IDP or internally displaced camps in the outskirts of Goma. These are camps that are really ramshackle camps. Just imagine people in plastic tarps and tents, living without much access to sewage or running water. And it was in these camps that there were shells that were presumably lobbed by either the Rwandan government or the rebels that they support, that hit some of these camps and killed quite a number of people in these camps. And so I think it's a good example of civilians being caught in the crossfire between these two sides.
You mentioned the M23 rebel group before, which is the main rebel group in the area. There's about 120 in the Eastern Congo area alone. But how significant has this rebel group been in creating anarchy and total violence in Eastern Congo, but for Congo in general?
Well, the M23 is, as you mentioned, the most important armed group at the moment. They're far from the only one. Imagine a situation, the Eastern DRC is roughly, or this conflict zone is roughly the size of England. And so there are many armed groups based there. M23 is probably the most prominent one. And the M23, they trace their heritage back. We began this segment talking about the 1996 invasion of the Eastern Congo. The M23 is really a descendant of armed groups that began back then in 1996. It has its roots in a community that you find both in the Congo and in Rwanda, the Tutsi community. Its leaders are from that community, and that community feels that it's deeply persecuted and discriminated against in the Congo, that it suffers from discrimination and hate speech. That is true. That community does suffer from discrimination and hate speech, but it's also become a way of life and in many ways a pretext for members of these armed groups to continue fighting and to continue fighting for reasons that go far beyond just discrimination, but also are much more about promoting their own personal narrow interests. So the M23, like many armed groups, is a mixture of, is fueled by a mixture of grievance and greed, by personal motives and more communal motives. And I think that unfortunately, because none of those has been addressed, because the Congolese government hasn't been able to either impose security and none of those grievances have been addressed, this has continued until today.
Jason, I mentioned before the situation in Congo and Rwanda has been the deadliest global war since World War II. In the last few years, M23 have, they've come back on the scene after years of, hiatus and hiding, and it's led to violence and death. What is the main cause of death currently in the area?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is that the DRC war is unlike other wars that people see on the television screens now. It's unlike Gaza, it's unlike Ukraine. This is not a war where people die in the trenches, they die from massive bombardments. That does exist, but most of the deaths in the Eastern DRC are indirect deaths. These are people who are displaced, who have to flee a rebel group or an army coming into their village, and then they die due to indirect causes. So the greatest cause of death are preventable diseases, hunger, malnutrition, dirty water, malaria that you get because you're bit by a mosquito and then don't have access to a health center. So these are unfortunately not very dramatic deaths that happen far away from television cameras and that are difficult for people to grapple with in terms of the importance of these deaths. We care little about people who die in a far-flung war zone in Africa due to these kinds of pedestrian causes. We care much more about drama, about places we can more readily identify with. And the Eastern Congo doesn't fit into those easy narratives, unfortunately. And so the greatest cause of death in the Eastern DRC are actually things that can be easily prevented. So the 6 million deaths that you mentioned, about 95% of those, first of all, it's very difficult for us to know how many actually have died. Grappling with these figures is something that we don't have data for, really.
But the armed
most
groups,
of those deaths,
Jason,
90 to 95% of them are actually indirect deaths.
But the groups are armed, are they not? The rebel groups, the M23, it is an armed group.
Of course, absolutely, yes, absolutely. These are armed groups that, largely speaking, are armed with old AK-47s, machine guns. But especially the M23 has much more sophisticated machinery because many of its troops are actually either Rwandan army troops or have been supplied by the Rwandan army.
So they haven't been supplied by outside sources. Other countries aren't, and other allies aren't supplying, Rwanda and its rebel groups with weapons.
No, almost all of the weapons that all the armed groups have in the Eastern Congo come either from the Congolese government or they come from neighboring governments. These are weapons that for other armed groups outside of the M23 are probably either bought on the black market or given to them by the Congolese government. The M23 has access to more sophisticated machinery because of its connections to the Rwandan army. And the Rwandan army and the Congolese army, they both buy off the international market.
So the M23 rebel group is obviously it's the group that Congolese people are the most terrified about, and they're making inroads to move into Goma. How successful have they been in that situation, in their aim to take over that area again?
Well, they've been quite successful. They've expanded. They began in November of 2021 in a very, very small area. The Eastern DRC is this is an area that is at the confluence of three different countries: Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC in the Congo. And they began and it's a beautiful area. There's a string of volcanoes that goes along that border. And it began fighting on the flanks of those volcanoes in November of 2021 in a very, very small area. But since then, it's expanded to a vast area that stretches far beyond that. And it has now come down to the south. There's a large lake there, Lake Kivu, and it controls now the entire area around the town of Goma. And so Goma is cut off from the rest of the Congo. It's wedged in between an area controlled by the M23 and the Rwandan border. And so the M23 has been able to expand its territory many folds and to completely surround the major trade hub of the region, Goma, which now includes over 1 million people, including hundreds of thousands of displaced people.
So are Congolese people preparing to join the fight to protect their own area? Well,
the Congolese government has put out a call for people to be recruited into the National Army, but what it's also done is it's officially recruited local armed groups, or it's arming local militia. They call these militia wazalendo, which in Swahili means patriots. And unfortunately, what this has done is it's thrown fuel on the fire of the violence. The Congolese government, instead of using its own troops that already struggle with discipline, what it's done is it's recruited local militias that have very little training. These are, in some cases, also include child soldiers into the fight. And these troops have no chain of command, or very little chain of command, little accountability, little discipline or training. And so throwing these troops into the fight is actually a threat to the local civilians. The other thing that it's done is it's hired private mercenaries from Eastern Europe, from France, and these private mercenaries are also on the front line. And then to make things even more complicated, you have troops from Southern Africa that have been sent from South Africa, Malawi, and Tanzania to support the Congolese government. And so you have an amalgam, you have a whole slew of troops on the front lines. And unfortunately, instead of making things better, instead of being able to push the M23 back, it's complicated things. And in the case, especially of these local militias that are ill-disciplined, it's created even more security threats for the local population.
Jason, we always called the Afghanistan war the forever war because it stretched 20 years with Western involvement. But the situation that's happening in Congo has been going on for even longer than that. Why has Western governments been so reluctant to get involved and help?
Well, there were times in which the Western governments have helped. It's easy to look at the Eastern Congo to think that it's always been fighting, that it's never changed, it's never gotten better. But there was a time when it got much better. In 2003, there was a peace deal that was signed between, at that point, the few rebel groups that controlled the Congo and the national government. Those groups then joined the national government. They forged a new constitution, the constitution that exists today in the Congo, and brought about not just a unified country, a unified national army, the new national army, but they brought about the new Democratic Republic of Congo that exists today, with democratic institutions, regular elections. And there are many problems with that constitution, with that, with this democratic dispensation. But it was hugely successful in many ways. Not only did it create a new democracy, but it demobilized over 130,000 soldiers, including 30,000 child soldiers. It decreased the number of displaced people by about 2 million people went home, were able to go home. And so it improved things. So and that was because of United Nations, because of Western government involvement. And so there have been moments at which donor pressure and donor involvement has been very helpful. And unfortunately, since then, since roughly 2006, which is when the first democratic elections happened in the Congo, since then, there's been less involvement. There's also been a lot of more pushback by the Congolese government that doesn't want Westerners getting involved in its own domestic affairs. And the Western governments have treated this as a post-conflict situation, whereas on the ground, all you really see is conflict escalating. And so there have been moments where it's been very successful. Unfortunately, now it's, I think, more divided than ever before, this community of Western countries in particular. And the United Nations has been sidelined. And so that diplomatic pressure that was successful in the past is not currently successful. And I think that Rwanda in particular is an example of this. The Western community, Western governments are divided in how dealing with Rwanda. There are many problems facing the Congo. As we've mentioned, there's over 100 different armed groups, and many of those armed groups will take a generation to figure out. Probably the most important factor dealing with those armed groups is the Congolese government itself, creating a stronger government, stronger security services, more accountability, and that will take many years. But with the case of the M23 and the Rwandan government, it's actually much easier than that, because if you pull support from the M23, that group will collapse. And yet, Western governments have been very reluctant to put that kind of pressure on the Rwandan government. And here, I think in particular, the UK government and France are probably the ones that need to be singled out, because they've been the most reluctant.
Sorry, Jason, to interrupt, but just a final question. Is that, I want to ask you how we fix the situation. So just going off what you were saying there, is the way to fix the situation in Congo, to restore it to, you know, its rich and resourceful country that it could be, to get it out of, you know, the poverty-stricken area that it currently is the main way to stop this, to dismantle the M23 rebel group?
Well, yes, I think that's certainly the first step in many steps that have to happen in order to make this conflict go away. Taking care of the M23 rebel group would be a step in the right direction. It wouldn't solve all the problems. I think there'll be violence in the Congo for years to come, without any doubt, and much of that has to do with creating a more accountable government. But dealing with the M23 would be a first step. In order to do so, it's actually, the levers are there, the pressure points are there, because the Rwandan government that backs the M23 is deeply supported by governments in the West, especially the UK government, that has just signed a very important migrant deal with the Rwandan government, deporting asylum seekers in the UK to Rwanda for treatment. And so that's one of the reasons the UK has been very reluctant to criticize Rwanda and to put pressure on Rwanda.
Jason Stearns from the Congo Research Group, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.